I was the boring husband until she found my travel journal from before we met. My wife treats me like a doormat because she thinks I've never lived. When she finds out I have a massive inheritance and a wild past she wasn't part of, her attitude shifts instantly. I have to decide if she loves me or the man she finally realized I am. The silence in our house didn't feel like peace. It felt like an omission. It was the sound of everything my wife, Elena, thought I wasn't. I remember the way she looked at me that Tuesday evening, a look I'd grown accustomed to over our 7 years of marriage. It was a mixture of pity and profound boredom. I was stirring a pot of pasta carbonara, meticulous with the heat so the eggs wouldn't scramble, while she sat at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone. "Mark," she said, not looking up, "the Millers invited us to go rock climbing in the Adirondacks next month. I told them we'd pass." I paused, the wooden spoon mid-air. Why? I might have enjoyed that. Elena finally looked at me, a small, weary smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It was the kind of smile you give a child who says they want to be an astronaut. "Honey, you get winded taking the groceries up 2 flights of stairs. You're a stay inside and read the manual kind of guy. Let's not pretend you're something you're not. It's okay. I've accepted that I married the human equivalent of a beige wall." She laughed, a light, airy sound that she meant to be playful, but it landed like lead in my chest. In Elena's eyes, I was the ultimate safe bet. I was the senior accountant who never missed a deadline, the husband who remembered to water the ferns, and the man who wore iron chinos even on Saturdays. To her, my life began the day we met at that boring corporate mixer, and everything before that was a blank, dusty slate. She saw my stability as a lack of imagination. She saw my calmness as a lack of passion. "Beige," I whispered to the pasta. "What was that?" she asked, already back to her screen. "Nothing, just seasoning." The truth was, I had built this beige life on purpose. I had spent my 20s vibrating at a frequency that nearly shattered me. I had seen the sun rise over the Himalayas and felt the sting of salt spray in the North Sea. I had lived enough for 3 lifetimes, and when I met Elena, I was simply tired. I wanted the quiet. I wanted the routine. I wanted the woman who looked like home. But lately, home felt like a place where I was being slowly erased. The shift started small. Elena began staying out later with her adventurous friends, people like Julian, a freelance photographer who wore leather jackets in the summer and talked loudly about his backpacking trips through Berlin. When they came over for dinner, I was the one who kept the wine glasses full and the coasters aligned. Julian would tell stories of sleeping on floors in Prague, and Elena would hang on every word, her eyes bright with a hunger I hadn't seen directed at me in years. "Mark's idea of an adventure is trying a new brand of artisanal sourdough," Julian joked once, clapping me on the shoulder. Elena chuckled, leaning her head on Julian's arm for a second too long. "He's consistent, I'll give him that. My rock, my very, very stationary rock." I smiled and offered them more Gruyere. I didn't tell them that I spoke fluent Czech because I lived in a tenement in Prague for a year. I didn't tell them the scar on my shoulder wasn't from a kitchen accident, but from a trekking mishap in the Andes. I let them have their fun. I thought my silence was a form of strength. I didn't realize it was becoming a cage. The breaking point didn't come with a shout. It came with a leak. A pipe burst in the attic on a rainy Friday while Elena was at work. I was up there with a shop vac and a stack of towels, moving old boxes of holiday decorations to keep them dry. In the corner, tucked behind a stack of my father's old encyclopedias, was a trunk I hadn't opened since we moved in. It was a heavy, weathered leather thing, scarred with baggage tags from airlines that didn't even exist anymore. As I dragged it toward the center of the room, the latch caught on my sweater and popped open. Inside, it wasn't just clothes. It was my journals, thick moleskin notebooks filled with my cramped, frantic handwriting, dozens of them, and tucked between the pages were photographs. I sat on the dusty floor, the sound of rain drumming on the roof, and picked up a photo. It was me, 10 years younger, shirtless and sun-browned, standing on the edge of a cliff in Amalfi. I looked electric. I looked like a man who wasn't afraid of the world. I heard the front door slam downstairs. "Mark? Why are the lights off? Did you forget the grocery list again?" Elena's voice floated up the stairs, tinged with that familiar sharp edge of annoyance. I didn't answer. I just stared at a journal entry from August 2014, written in a bar in Tangier, about the night I decided I was finally ready to settle down and find someone to share a quiet life with. I heard her footsteps on the attic stairs. "Mark, are you up here? I swear, if you're organizing the screws by size while the kitchen is—" She stopped. She was standing in the doorway, her silk blouse damp from the rain, her eyes landing on the open trunk, on the photos, on the man she didn't recognize. The air in the attic felt thick, heavy with the smell of old paper and rain-dampened wood. Elena didn't move. She stood there, her car keys still clutched in her hand, the metallic jingle the only sound in the room. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice dropping the sharp edge of annoyance for something closer to genuine confusion. She stepped toward the trunk, her heels clicking on the floorboards. I didn't close it. I didn't hide the photos. I just sat there on the floor, my legs crossed, feeling the ghost of the man in the pictures, the man who had hitchhiked across the Anatolian plateau, staring back at me. "Just some things from before," I said quietly, "before we met." Elena reached down and picked up a photograph that had fluttered to the floor. It was a shot of me in a crowded, neon-lit street in Tokyo, laughing with a group of locals, a deep scar visible on my forearm that I usually kept covered by long sleeves. "Is this you?" she whispered. She turned the photo over, seeing the date and a scribbled note in Japanese. "Mark, you told me you'd never been out of the country except for that one trip to Toronto with your parents." "I never said that, Elena," I replied, looking her in the eye. "You assumed that, and whenever I tried to talk about my past, you'd yawn or tell me about your day at the gallery. After a while, I just stopped trying to compete with the version of me you'd already decided was real." She didn't hear the sting in my voice. She was too busy flipping through the journals. Her eyes skipped over the pages, catching fragments of my life. The time I spent a month in a monastery in Bhutan, the summer I worked on a commercial fishing boat in Alaska, the nights I spent writing poetry in a basement in Berlin. "You lived in Paris?" she gasped, pointing to a sketch I'd made of the Seine at 3 a.m. "For 2 years? You hated French food." "I hate overpriced French food," I corrected. "I loved the bread I bought for €1 while I was studying at the Sorbonne." Elena sat down on a dusty crate, the journals spread out around her like a deck of cards. The disdain she usually carried, that beige filter she viewed me through, was flickering. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking at the man who forgot to take out the recycling. She was looking at a stranger. "Wait," she said, her finger pausing on a bank statement tucked into the back of the 2016 journal. It was from a private wealth management firm. Her brow furrowed as she read the numbers. "Mark, what is this? This says trust distribution. These figures, they can't be right." I felt a coldness settle in my stomach. That was the part I had guarded most fiercely, not the adventure, the security. My grandfather was an early investor in several shipping firms. He left me a significant amount. I've never touched the principal. I don't need to. My salary covers our life, and I like working. Elena looked at the balance, a number with enough zeros to change a life 10 times over, and then looked at our cramped attic. She looked at my faded sweater. Then she looked at me. "You're rich," she breathed. It wasn't a question. It was a revelation. "We've been living on your mid-level accountant salary, worrying about the mortgage, and you have this? Why didn't you tell me? Why have we been living like this?" "Because I wanted a partner, Elena, not a passenger. I wanted someone who loved the beige man, someone who loved the routine, the quiet, the person I chose to become after I was done running. If I had led with the money and the stories, I would have never known if you actually loved me." She stood up, the journal shaking slightly in her hand. "You lied to me. By omission, you lied to me every single day. You let me think you were ordinary, and you treated me like I was beneath you because of it. You let Julian mock me at our dinner table. You let your friends call me the auditor. You looked at me with bored eyes for 7 years because you thought I had nothing to offer but a steady paycheck." "That's not fair," she snapped, but her eyes were darting back to the bank statement. I saw it then. It was subtle, a glint of something new. It wasn't love. It wasn't even apology. It was a sudden, frantic recalculation. She wasn't seeing the man who hitchhiked through Europe. She was seeing the man who could buy the gallery she worked at. She was seeing the man who could take her to the places Julian only talked about.
"Mark, honey," she said, her voice suddenly softening, dropping an octave into a purr I hadn't heard since our honeymoon. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch my arm. I'm overwhelmed. I didn't realize you were holding all this inside. We should finally celebrate this. We should finally take that trip to Greece, the real Greece. You could show me everything." She looked at me with wide, shimmering eyes. The boredom completely vanished, replaced by a terrifyingly bright hunger. I looked at her hand on my arm. It felt heavy. It felt like a tether. "Is that right?" I asked. "You want to see the real Greece, or do you just want to see the version of me that can pay for it?" "You can't say that," she whispered, leaning in. "I'm your wife. I finally feel like I know you." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No, Elena, you finally think I'm worth knowing. There's a difference." I picked up the trunk, closed the lid, and locked it. I didn't put it back in the corner. I carried it past her, down the stairs, leaving her standing in the dusty light of the attic, clutching a photograph of a man she never bothered to ask about.
The next few days were a masterclass in psychological whiplash. The woman who had sighed when I spoke about my day at the office was gone. In her place was a doting, inquisitive stranger who seemed to have developed a sudden, intense interest in my every thought. "Mark, darling, I made that sea bass you liked from that little bistro in Marseille," Elena said, setting a plate down with a flourish. She had spent the afternoon shopping, not for groceries, but for a new silk wrap that cost more than our monthly utility bill. "You never told me you spent a summer in the south of France. Tell me about the light there. Is it as golden as they say?" I looked at the fish, then at her. The beige husband was being treated like a king, but the crown felt like it was made of lead. "The light was fine, Elena. I was usually too busy working at the docks to notice the hue of the sunset." "Working the docks," she repeated, her eyes shining. "So rugged. I always knew there was a fire under that calm exterior." I almost laughed. A week ago, she'd told her mother over the phone that my calm exterior was actually just a lack of personality. Now it was fire. It was amazing how a few extra zeros in a bank balance could act as a universal translator for a person's character. The shift wasn't just at home. Elena started inviting people over, the adventurous crowd, but the dynamic had flipped. Julian was there on Friday night, leaning against my kitchen counter, but he looked smaller. Elena had clearly whispered something to Julian because he wasn't making jokes about my sourdough anymore. "So, Mark," Julian said, his voice lacking its usual bravado, "I hear you spent some time in the Andes. I've always wanted to do the Inca Trail, but, the permits are a nightmare." "I didn't take the trail," I said, sipping my water. "I went through the back routes with a group of local miners. No permits, just a lot of coca leaves and altitude sickness." The room went quiet. I saw Elena beam with pride, as if she had personally discovered a rare artifact. She reached out and squeezed my hand, her diamond wedding ring catching the light. "My husband is full of surprises, aren't you, honey? We were thinking maybe we should look at houses in the Highlands, something with a view, something that matches our true lifestyle." Our true lifestyle. I felt a cold prickle of realization. She wasn't falling in love with me. She was falling in love with a brochure. She was curating a new version of our life, where I was the rugged, wealthy protagonist, and she was the glamorous co-star. The beige man had been painted over with gold leaf, but underneath, I was still the same person, the person she had looked down on for 7 years. Later that night, after the guests left, Elena cornered me in the bedroom. She was wearing a perfume she usually reserved for galas. "Mark," she whispered, sliding her arms around my neck, "why didn't you trust me? We could have been living this way the whole time. We wasted so many years being ordinary." "I didn't think we were wasting them," I said, my hands resting tentatively on her waist. "I thought we were building something. I thought the ordinary was the point. I wanted a life that didn't need a passport or a trust fund to be meaningful." "But look at what we can do now," she countered, her voice rising with excitement. "I looked at some villas in Tuscany today. We could move. You could quit that soul-crushing job. We could finally live. I like my job, Elena. It gives me structure, and I like this house. My father helped me pick it out."
She pulled back just an inch, a flicker of the old impatience crossing her face. "Don't be stubborn, Mark. You're playing small. You have the world at your feet, and you're still acting like an accountant." The mask slipped for just a second. The disdain was still there, the belief that who I chose to be wasn't good enough. She only valued the parts of me that were loud, expensive, or exciting. The man who liked to water the ferns and read the manual was still an embarrassment to her. He just happened to have a very large bank account now. I lay awake that night listening to her rhythmic breathing. I realized that the discovery of my past hadn't saved our marriage. It had indexed its price. I decided then that I needed to know for sure. I needed to know if there was any part of her that still loved the man who stirred the pasta carbonara, or if she was already packing her bags for a version of me that didn't exist anymore. The next morning, I told her I had a meeting with my wealth manager. "Oh, should I come?" she asked, already reaching for her blazer. "No," I said, my voice steady. "This is just some boring paperwork, taxes, distributions, that sort of thing. But why don't you look into those Tuscany villas? Get the details, the costs, everything." Her face lit up like a child on Christmas. "Really? You mean it? I want to see what our future looks like," I said. And I meant it. While she spent the afternoon daydreaming of marble floors and Italian sun, I went to a small office downtown. But I wasn't meeting a wealth manager. I was meeting an old friend from my wild days, a man who knew exactly how to disappear and exactly how to find out if someone was following you for the right reasons. I was setting a trap, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, dying hope that she would prove me wrong.
The trap was simple, almost elegant in its quietness. I told Elena that due to some complexities with the trust and a sudden audit of my grandfather's offshore accounts, my liquid assets had been temporarily frozen. I told her we needed to scale back, just for a few months, until the legal dust settled. I watched her face as I said it. We were sitting in that same kitchen where she'd called me beige only a week prior. The light in her eyes didn't just dim, it extinguished. "Frozen?" she repeated, the words sounding like a broken glass in her mouth. "But the villa? I already sent an inquiry for the one in San Gimignano. I told Julian we were hosting a New Year's bash there." "We'll have to cancel," I said, my voice intentionally weary. "In fact, to cover the legal fees, I might have to take out a second mortgage on this house. It's back to the accountant's salary for a while, Elena. Maybe even tighter." She didn't reach for my hand this time. She didn't tell me we'd get through it together. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at our modest backyard. "So we're back to this?" she whispered. "Back to being ordinary? Is that so bad?" I asked, leaning forward. "We have each other. We have the life we built before the journals. Wasn't that enough?" She turned around, and for the first time I saw the raw, unfiltered resentment she'd been masking with adventure. "It was never enough, Mark. I was waiting for you to become someone. I thought the money in the past meant you were finally that person. Now you're telling me it was just a glimpse of a life I'm never going to have?" The confrontation escalated quickly. Within 48 hours, the doting wife was gone. The sea bass was replaced by cold silence. She started taking long walks that turned into hours-long disappearances. On the third night, I didn't have to wonder where she was. I followed the trail she left, not out of suspicion, but out of a need for closure. I found her at a high-end lounge downtown, the kind of place where the drinks cost more than my weekly groceries. She was sitting in a corner booth with Julian. I stood in the shadows near the coat check, the collar of my coat turned up. The music was low, a pulsing jazz beat that felt like a heartbeat. "He's a fraud, Julian," she said, her voice sharp with wine and spite. "He teased me with this world of travel and wealth just to snatch it away. He's back to counting pennies and talking about his quiet life. I can't do it anymore. I feel like I'm suffocating in that house." "I told you," Julian said, his voice smooth and opportunistic. "A leopard doesn't change its spots. He was always boring, Elena. The journals were just a fluke, a ghost of a man who died a long time ago." "I'm leaving him," she said, and my heart didn't break.
It stayed perfectly still. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. If those accounts are frozen, I want my share of the house and the savings. I'm not spending another year being the accountant's wife." I stepped out from the shadows then. The look on her face wasn't guilt. It was pure, unadulterated shock. "Mark," she gasped, clutching her glass. "What are you doing here?" "I was looking for the woman I married," I said, walking slowly toward their table. Julian tried to stand, but I gave him a look, the look of the man who had stared down wolves in the Siberian tundra, and he sat back down, suddenly very interested in his gin and tonic. I looked at Elena. "The accounts aren't frozen, Elena. There is no audit. There are no legal fees." She froze. "What?" "It was a test," I said quietly. "I wanted to see if you loved the man who lived those stories or just the stories themselves. I wanted to see if you could love the beige husband when the gold leaf was gone. Mark, I was just frustrated. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," I interrupted. "You weren't waiting for me to become someone. You were waiting for me to provide a lifestyle you didn't want to earn for yourself. You called me a doormat because I was kind, and you called me boring because I was at peace. But you're the one who is empty, Elena. You're the one who needs a passport and a pile of cash just to feel like you exist." I took a single envelope out of my pocket and laid it on the table. It wasn't a bank statement. It was the name of a divorce attorney, the best one in the city. "You wanted to leave," I said. "I'm making it easy for you, but don't expect the trust fund to follow you out the door. My grandfather's will was very specific about lifestyle maintenance in the event of a no-fault divorce. You'll get exactly what you brought into this marriage, nothing but your ambition." I turned to walk away, but I stopped and looked at Julian. "By the way, Julian, that story about the Andes, it wasn't a fluke. I survived that mountain because I knew when to cut the dead weight. I suggest you learn to do the same." I walked out of the lounge and into the cool night air. For the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel like an accountant. I didn't feel like a traveler. I just felt free.
Once Elena realized the legal ironclad nature of the premarital trust, the fire in her eyes turned to a cold, businesslike efficiency. There were no more dramatic pleas for the real grease. No more attempts to rekindle a flame that had never truly burned for me. She moved out on a drizzly Tuesday, the same kind of day I had found the journals. I watched from the porch as she loaded her designer suitcases into a taxi. She didn't look back at the boring house or the beige man she was leaving behind. She was chasing a horizon that always stayed just out of reach. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to chase it with her. For a few months, the silence in the house was heavy. I kept my job at the accounting firm. My colleagues noticed a change, though they couldn't quite put their finger on it. I still wore the ironed chinos, and I still arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, but there was a weight to my presence now, a quiet confidence of a man who no longer had anything to prove. I eventually sold the house. It held too many ghosts of the person I had pretended to be to keep a dying marriage alive. I moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the river. It's simple, sparse, and filled with books. I still have the leather trunk, but it isn't tucked away in an attic anymore. It sits in my living room, serving as a coffee table. Sometimes when the evening light hits the river just right, I open one of the moleskins and read. I don't read them to mourn the man I was. I read them to remind myself that the ordinary life I lead now is a choice. It is a luxury I earned through years of chaos. I've started traveling again, but differently. No more hitchhiking through war zones or sleeping on fishing boats. Last month, I went to a small village in the Cotswolds. I spent my days walking the rolling hills and my evenings drinking ale in a pub where nobody knew my name or my bank balance. I met a woman there, a local librarian named Sarah. We sat by the fire and she asked me what I did for a living. "I'm an accountant," I said, and for the first time in a decade, I said it with a smile. "That sounds peaceful," she replied.
Genuinely, I imagine you're a man who appreciates a good system. We talked for hours, not about mountain peaks or trust funds, but about the books we love and the way the fog settled over the valley. I realized then that I didn't need to be electric to be seen. I just needed to be with someone who looked at the beige wall and saw the strength of the foundation, not the lack of a mural. Elena occasionally pops up on my social media feed, or she did before I finally hit block. The last I saw, she was in Bali with Julian, looking radiant in a photo filtered to perfection. But even through the screen, I could see the familiar restlessness in her eyes. She was still looking for the next adventure, the next story, the next man who could provide a backdrop for her life. I closed my laptop and went to water my ferns. I used to think my past was a secret I had to keep to protect my future. Now I know that my past is just a part of the map that led me here. Life isn't about the grand adventures we tell people about at dinner parties. It's about the quiet moments we're willing to protect when the world stops watching. I am no longer the husband who was too boring. I am the man who finally knows what he's worth, and that, I've found, is the greatest adventure of all. We often think that being exciting is the price of admission for being loved. We hide our scars, our wealth, or our quietness because we fear being ordinary. But the right person doesn't need you to be a mountain climber or a millionaire. They just need you to be real. My question for you is this: have you ever felt like you had to hide a part of yourself just to keep someone interested? And was the person they loved actually you, or just the mask you were wearing? Tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more tales of human heart and hidden truths. Until next time.